Wolf Lady invited a poor Omega as a joke to mock him. But when he arrived, everyone was stunned. The grand estate of the Thornwood family stood like a monument to wealth and power on the outskirts of Boston, its stone walls weathered by centuries of New England winters. Inside, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off polished marble floors. It was the night of Lady Victoria Thornwood's annual Winter Gala, an event that drew the city's elite like moths to flame, each one eager to display their status and forge connections that would carry them through another year of prosperity. Victoria herself stood near the entrance, her emerald gown catching the light as she surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a queen. At 28, she had inherited not only her father's shipping fortune, but also his sharp business acumen and, some whispered, his cruel streak. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate arrangement, diamonds glinting at her throat and wrists. She was beautiful, in the way a winter storm is beautiful, striking, cold, and potentially dangerous. "Did you actually send him an invitation?" her cousin Margaret whispered, sidling up with a champagne flute in hand. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course I did. Can you imagine? James Whitmore, the Omega who cleans the offices at Father's shipping company, walking through these doors? The look on everyone's faces will be priceless." Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's see what happens next. Margaret giggled behind her hand. "You're terrible, Victoria. The poor man probably doesn't even own proper evening attire." "Precisely the point," Victoria replied, her voice dripping with amusement. "I want everyone to see the contrast. These people need to be reminded of their place in the world. And what better way than to parade someone from the absolute bottom of society through our midst?" The invitation had been sent 3 weeks prior, delivered to the cramped boarding house where James Whitmore rented a single room on the 3rd floor. Victoria had personally penned it, her handwriting elegant and formal, requesting the honor of his presence at her winter gala. She'd even included a note suggesting he might find the evening enlightening and full of opportunities. It was a masterpiece of false kindness, and she'd laughed as she sealed the envelope. What Victoria didn't know was that James Whitmore had spent those 3 weeks in a state of careful consideration. At 32, he had learned to read between the lines of life's cruelties. He knew exactly what Victoria Thornwood intended. He'd seen the way she looked at him on the rare occasions their paths crossed at the shipping office, her gaze sliding over him as if he were part of the furniture, barely worth acknowledging. He understood that this invitation was meant to humiliate him, but James Whitmore was not the man Victoria thought he was. He had arrived in Boston 5 years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and a past he never spoke of. He'd taken the janitorial position at Thornwood Shipping because it was honest work that paid enough to keep him fed and housed, and because it allowed him to remain invisible. Invisibility had become his greatest asset, a shield against a world that had taught him the cost of being seen. The boarding house where he lived was a far cry from the Thornwood estate. The walls were thin, the heating unreliable, and the other residents were a collection of dock workers, seamstresses, and others who scraped by on the margins of Boston's prosperity. But James kept his room immaculate, his few possessions organized with military precision. On the small desk by the window sat a collection of books, philosophy, history, literature, borrowed from the public library and read by candlelight late into the night. On the evening of the gala, James stood before the cracked mirror in his room, adjusting the collar of a shirt he'd spent hours washing and pressing until it was crisp and white. His suit was old but well-maintained, the fabric showing its age but clean and properly fitted. He'd saved for months to have it tailored, taking it to an elderly seamstress in the North End who'd done the work for a fraction of the usual cost after he'd helped repair her shop door. His reflection stared back at him, a man of average height with dark blonde hair that he'd trimmed himself, careful and precise. His face was lean, marked by the kind of quiet strength that came from enduring hardship without breaking. His eyes, a deep gray, held a depth that most people never bothered to notice. As an Omega, he'd learned early that society expected him to be meek, submissive, forgettable. He'd learned to use those expectations as camouflage. But tonight, he would step out of the shadows. The walk from his boarding house to the Thornwood estate took nearly an hour. James could have taken a streetcar part of the way, but he preferred to walk, using the time to prepare himself mentally for what lay ahead. The December air was sharp and cold, his breath forming clouds in the darkness. Snow had fallen earlier in the week, and patches of ice gleamed on the cobblestones under the gas lamps. As he walked through the wealthier neighborhoods, the houses grew larger and more ornate, their windows glowing with warm light. He could hear the distant sounds of music and laughter, the privileged classes celebrating another year of their good fortune. James felt no bitterness toward them. Bitterness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he felt a calm determination, a sense of purpose that had been building since the moment he'd opened Victoria's invitation. The Thornwood estate came into view as he rounded the final corner, its facade illuminated by torches that lined the long driveway. Carriages were still arriving, depositing elegantly dressed guests who hurried toward the warmth of the house. James paused for a moment, taking in the scene. This was a world he'd once known intimately, though from a very different perspective. The memories threatened to surface, but he pushed them down, focusing instead on the present moment. He approached the entrance with steady steps, his posture straight and confident despite the worn state of his clothing. The doorman, a large man in livery, looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Tradesman's entrance is around back," the doorman said, his voice flat. James reached into his coat pocket and produced the invitation, its cream-colored paper and gold lettering unmistakable. "I was invited by Lady Thornwood herself." The doorman's expression shifted from disdain to confusion. He took the invitation, examined it closely, then looked at James again, as if trying to reconcile the elegant script with the modest man standing before him. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he stepped aside. "Very well, but mind yourself." James nodded politely and stepped through the doors into a world of light and luxury. The entrance hall was magnificent, with soaring ceilings and walls adorned with oil paintings of Thornwood ancestors. A grand staircase curved upward, its banister polished to a mirror shine. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of flowers, hothouse roses and lilies arranged in massive displays. The sound of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom, mingling with the chatter of conversation and the clink of crystal. For a moment, James simply stood there, allowing his senses to adjust. Then he moved forward, following the flow of guests toward the ballroom. Victoria was holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by a cluster of admirers, young men from prominent families, older women dripping with jewels, business associates of her late father. She was in the middle of a story, her hands gesturing gracefully when someone touched her arm. "Victoria, darling, I think your special guest has arrived," Margaret said, her voice pitched low, but unable to hide her amusement. Victoria turned, her eyes scanning the entrance to the ballroom, and then she saw him. James Whitmore stood at the threshold, his presence somehow commanding attention despite his simple attire. He wasn't looking around nervously, or shrinking from the opulence surrounding him. Instead, he stood with a quiet dignity, his gaze calm and assessing as he took in the room. The contrast between his worn but immaculate suit and the elaborate gowns and tailcoats around him should have made him look ridiculous, out of place. But it didn't. There was something in the way he carried himself, a natural grace and confidence that couldn't be bought or taught. As he moved into the room, conversations began to falter. People turned to look, their expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion to outright shock. An Omega, clearly of modest means, walking into Victoria Thornwood's exclusive gala as if he had every right to be there. Victoria felt her smile freeze on her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to look uncomfortable, embarrassed, painfully aware of his inadequacy. Instead, James Whitmore looked like a man who knew exactly who he was and felt no need to apologize for it. "Who is that?" someone whispered nearby. "I have no idea, but did you see the way he entered? Such composure. His suit is practically threadbare, but somehow he makes it look intentional, almost noble." Victoria's jaw tightened. She'd wanted to create a spectacle, to remind everyone of the natural order of things. But the spectacle was rapidly spinning out of her control. James's eyes found hers across the room. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, with deliberate purpose, he began walking toward her. The crowd parted before him, people stepping aside almost unconsciously. There was no aggression in his approach, no challenge in his expression. He simply moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. When he reached Victoria, he stopped at a respectful distance and inclined his head in a polite bow. "Lady Thornwood, thank you for your invitation. It was most generous of you." His voice was deep and cultured, with an accent that suggested education and refinement. Victoria felt a flutter of unease. This was not the voice of a simple janitor. This was the voice of someone who'd been trained in proper diction, who'd spent time in circles far removed from boarding houses and menial labor. "Mr. Whitmore," she managed, her voice cool despite her growing confusion. "How unexpected that you could attend." "I wouldn't have missed it," James replied, his gray eyes meeting hers steadily. "It's not every day one receives an invitation to such a prestigious event. I'm curious to see what the evening holds." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no hint that he understood the cruel joke she'd intended. But something in his gaze suggested he knew exactly what she'd planned, and he'd come anyway, on his own terms. Margaret leaned in, her curiosity overcoming her sense of propriety. "Mr. Whitmore, forgive me, but I don't believe we've been introduced. How do you know Victoria?" "I work at Thornwood Shipping," James said simply. "I maintain the offices." A ripple of reaction went through the nearby guests. A janitor. Victoria had invited a janitor to her gala. The absurdity of it should have been the talk of the evening, a scandal that would cement Victoria's reputation for audacious cruelty. But something strange was happening. Instead of mockery, people were looking at James with something approaching respect. His honesty about his position, delivered without shame or apology, had disarmed them. And his bearing, that inexplicable dignity, made it impossible to simply dismiss him as a curiosity or a joke. "That must be demanding work," an older gentleman said, stepping forward. He was Richard Blackwell, a banker who'd known Victoria's father. "Keeping those offices in order, I mean. I've been to the Thornwood building. It's quite extensive." "It is," James agreed. "But I find satisfaction in work well done, regardless of its nature. There's a certain peace in creating order from chaos, in ensuring that everything functions as it should." "A philosopher janitor," someone murmured, and there was no mockery in the tone, only genuine interest. Victoria felt control of the situation slipping further from her grasp. She'd expected humiliation, his or, failing that, her own amusement at his discomfort. What she hadn't expected was this: a room full of Boston's elite treating a working-class Omega with something approaching fascination. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the growing conversation. "Surely you must feel somewhat out of place here. This is quite different from your usual environment." It was a direct challenge, an attempt to reassert the social hierarchy she'd intended to demonstrate. James turned his full attention to her, and for the first time that evening, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep, weary knowledge. "I've been in many environments, Lady Thornwood," he said quietly. "I've learned that people are much the same everywhere, regardless of the quality of their clothing or the size of their bank accounts. We all want to be seen, to be valued, to matter. The settings change, but the fundamental human needs remain constant. The words hung in the air, simple but profound. Victoria felt her cheeks flush. Somehow, without raising his voice or showing any disrespect, James Whitmore had just delivered a rebuke that cut to the heart of her cruelty. He'd exposed the emptiness of her social games, the hollowness of using another person's dignity as entertainment. "Well said," Richard Blackwell declared, raising his glass. "Well said indeed. Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, are you a reading man? You speak like someone familiar with philosophy." "I read when I can," James replied. "The public library is one of Boston's great treasures. I've been working my way through the classics: Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius. Recently I've been reading Emerson. His essays on self-reliance resonate deeply." "Emerson!" An elderly woman in purple silk pushed forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Oh, I adore Emerson. What did you think of his views on conformity?" And just like that, James Whitmore was drawn into a genuine conversation about literature and philosophy with some of the most educated people in Boston. Victoria watched in growing horror as her carefully planned humiliation transformed into something else entirely. A social triumph for the very person she'd meant to mock. People were gathering around James now, asking questions, sharing their own thoughts on books and ideas. He responded to each person with thoughtful attention, his answers revealing a depth of knowledge and understanding that belied his humble circumstances. He quoted passages from memory, drew connections between different philosophical traditions, and spoke with the kind of genuine passion that only comes from someone who reads, not for social status, but for the pure love of learning. "How does a janitor come to be so well read?" someone finally asked, the question everyone was thinking. James's expression grew distant for a moment, as if he were looking at something far away. "Life takes us down unexpected paths," he said finally. "I wasn't always a janitor, but circumstances change, and we adapt. The one thing I've held on to through all those changes is my love of learning. Books don't care about your social status or your occupation. They offer their wisdom to anyone willing to receive it." There was a story there, Victoria realized. A history that James Whitmore kept carefully hidden beneath his humble exterior. Who had he been before he became a janitor? What circumstances had brought him so low? And why did he carry himself like a man who'd lost everything but his dignity? The evening progressed, and Victoria found herself increasingly sidelined at her own gala. James had become the center of attention, not through any effort of his own, but simply by being authentically himself. People were drawn to his quiet strength, his obvious intelligence, his complete lack of pretension. He didn't try to impress anyone, or claim to be more than he was. He simply existed in his truth, and that truth was compelling in a way that Victoria's carefully constructed social persona could never be. She watched as Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, one of Boston's most formidable society matrons, engaged James in a lengthy discussion about the working conditions in the city's factories. James spoke knowledgeably about the struggles of the working poor, not with anger or resentment, but with compassion and insight. He described the daily challenges faced by people trying to survive on inadequate wages, the impossible choices between food and heat, the constant fear of illness or injury that could destroy a family's fragile stability. "You speak from experience," Mrs. Hartford observed, her usual haughty demeanor softened by genuine interest. "I do," James confirmed. "I've lived it. I live it still. But I also know that many people in more fortunate circumstances simply don't understand the reality of poverty. It's not a moral failing or a lack of ambition. It's a system that makes it nearly impossible to climb out once you've fallen in. The working poor aren't lazy. They're exhausted. They're not stupid. They're denied education. They're not hopeless. They're systematically prevented from accessing hope." His words carried weight because they came from lived experience, not abstract theory. Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, forced to confront the reality of the inequality that supported their comfortable lives. But others nodded thoughtfully, as if James had articulated something they'd sensed, but never quite understood. Victoria felt a strange mix of emotions churning in her chest. Anger at having her plans thwarted, embarrassment at being upstaged at her own event. But also something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge. A grudging respect for the man who'd walked into her trap and somehow turned it into a triumph. As the evening wore on, James moved through the ballroom with easy grace, speaking with various guests, always polite, always genuine. He didn't eat or drink excessively, didn't take advantage of the luxury surrounding him. He simply engaged with people as equals, regardless of their wealth or status. Victoria found herself watching him, unable to look away. There was a mystery here, a puzzle she suddenly needed to solve. Who was James Whitmore really? What had brought him to Boston, to her father's company, to a life of such humble circumstances? And why did he seem so completely at peace with himself, when she, with all her wealth and privilege, felt constantly anxious, constantly performing, constantly afraid of losing her position? Near midnight, as the gala began to wind down, James approached Victoria once more. The crowd had thinned, many guests having already departed. Victoria stood near the windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, a glass of champagne in her hand that she'd barely touched. "Lady Thornwood," James said quietly, and she turned to face him. "I wanted to thank you again for the invitation before I take my leave." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. In the softer light of the late evening, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won wisdom. He was handsome in an understated way, but it was his eyes that held her, those deep gray eyes that had seen too much and somehow remained kind. "Why did you come?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "You knew what I intended. You knew this was meant to humiliate you. So why did you come?" James was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "Because I wanted to see if you were as cruel as I suspected, or if there was something more beneath the surface. Because I thought perhaps you needed to learn that dignity isn't determined by wealth or status. And because..." He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "I was curious to see what would happen if I refused to play the role you'd assigned me." "And what did you discover?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you're unhappy," James said simply. "That you use cruelty as a shield against your own insecurities. That you've built your identity on a foundation of superiority that requires you to constantly prove yourself by diminishing others. And that somewhere beneath all that armor, there might be a person worth knowing, if you'd ever let anyone see her." The words should have felt like an attack, but they didn't. They felt like truth, delivered without malice, simply observed and stated. Victoria felt something crack inside her, a wall she'd built so carefully over the years developing its first fissure. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but there was no heat in the words. "I know what I see," James replied. "I know what it looks like when someone is performing rather than living. I know because I've done it myself, in different ways, for different reasons. The difference is, I've learned that the performance eventually becomes a prison." He inclined his head in a final, respectful bow. "Thank you for the evening, Lady Thornwood. It was enlightening, though perhaps not in the way you intended." As he turned to leave, Victoria found herself speaking again. "Wait." James paused, looking back at her. "Who are you, really?" she asked. "And don't tell me you're just a janitor. I saw how you moved through this room, how you spoke, how you carried yourself. You've been trained in etiquette and educated far beyond what your current circumstances suggest. So who are you, James Whitmore?" For a long moment, James simply looked at her, as if weighing whether to answer honestly. Finally he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I'm someone who learned that everything you think defines you, wealth, status, family name, can be taken away in an instant. I'm someone who discovered that when you lose everything, you find out who you really are beneath all the trappings. And I'm someone who chose to rebuild his life on a foundation of authenticity rather than pretense, even if that meant living in poverty and working as a janitor. What happened to you? Victoria asked, genuinely curious now. That, James said with a sad smile, is a story for another time, if there ever is another time. Good night, Lady Thornwood. I hope you find what you're looking for. He walked away then, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty ballroom. Victoria watched him go, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world. She'd meant to prove her superiority, to remind herself and everyone else of her place at the top of society's hierarchy. Instead, she'd been given a mirror that reflected her own emptiness, held up by a man who had nothing and yet possessed everything that truly mattered. The next morning, Victoria woke late, her head aching from champagne and troubled dreams. She lay in her enormous bed, staring at the silk canopy above her, replaying the events of the previous evening. The gala had been a success by all conventional measures. People had eaten, drunk, danced, and departed satisfied. But Victoria felt no satisfaction, only a gnawing sense of having been fundamentally challenged and found wanting. She rose and dressed, waving away her maid's offers of assistance. She needed to think, to understand what had happened. On impulse, she decided to visit the Thornwood shipping offices. It was Sunday, and the building would be mostly empty, but she knew James would be there. He worked 7 days a week, she'd learned from the building manager, arriving early and leaving late, maintaining the offices with meticulous care. The streets of Boston were quiet in the gray morning light, a few people hurrying to church services, vendors setting up their carts for the Sunday market. Victoria's carriage carried her through the city to the waterfront district where the Thornwood building stood, a solid brick structure that had housed her family's business for 3 generations. She entered through the main doors, her footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The building smelled of lemon oil and beeswax, the scent of James's careful maintenance. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, where the main offices were located, and found him there, as she'd known she would. James was on his hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor near the windows. He'd removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, his movements efficient and practiced. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the space he'd already cleaned to a brilliant shine. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his face before settling into his usual calm expression. He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. Lady Thornwood, I didn't expect to see you here. I needed to speak with you, Victoria said, feeling suddenly uncertain. In this space, surrounded by the evidence of his labor, she felt like the intruder, not him. About last night? James asked. About everything, Victoria replied. About who you are, about what you said to me, about why I can't stop thinking about it. James gestured to a bench near the windows. Would you like to sit? They sat together, an unlikely pair. The wealthy heiress in her expensive day dress, and the janitor in his work clothes, both of them somehow stripped of their usual armor, in the quiet Sunday morning light. Tell me your story, Victoria said. Please, I need to understand. James was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully managed but never quite healed. I was born in Philadelphia, he began. My father was a professor of classics at the university. My mother the daughter of a shipping merchant. We weren't as wealthy as your family, but we were comfortable, respected. I was educated at the finest schools, groomed to follow my father into academia. I studied at Harvard, graduated with honors, began teaching. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. I was engaged to be married to a woman from a good family. Everything was arranged. Everything was perfect. And then my father made a series of poor investments, trusting the wrong people. Within 6 months, we'd lost everything. The house, the savings, everything. My father died of a heart attack from the stress. My mother followed 6 months later. I think she died of a broken heart. Victoria felt a chill run through her. And your engagement? Ended immediately, James said without bitterness. Her family couldn't allow their daughter to marry a penniless Omega with no prospects. I understood. It was the practical decision. But it taught me something important about the world I'd lived in. That all those relationships, all that respect and affection, was conditional. It was based on what I could offer, not who I was. So you came to Boston. Eventually. First, I tried to rebuild in Philadelphia, but the scandal of my father's failure followed me. No university would hire me. I took whatever work I could find, tutoring, clerking, manual labor. I moved from city to city, always hoping the next place would offer a fresh start. I arrived in Boston 5 years ago, with almost nothing. The janitor position at your father's company was the first stable work I'd found in years. I took it gratefully. But you could do so much more, Victoria protested. With your education, your intelligence. Could I? James interrupted gently. I'm an Omega from a disgraced family with no connections and no references. I'm 32 years old with a 5-year gap in my professional history. Who would hire me to teach when I can barely afford decent clothes? The world doesn't work the way you think it does, Lady Thornwood. Talent and education matter, but they're not enough. You need opportunity, and opportunity requires resources I don't have. Victoria felt shame wash over her, hot and uncomfortable. She'd never considered how difficult it would be to climb back up after falling. She'd assumed that anyone with ability could succeed, that poverty was a choice or a moral failing. But James's story revealed a different truth, that the system was designed to keep people in their place, that one disaster could destroy a lifetime of achievement, and that rebuilding was nearly impossible without help. Why do you stay? She asked. Why not leave Boston? Try somewhere else. Because I'm tired of running, James said simply. Because I've learned that geography doesn't solve internal problems. Because I've found a kind of peace here, in the simplicity of honest work and a quiet life. I'm not happy in the way I once imagined happiness, but I'm content. I've learned to find meaning in small things. A well-cleaned floor, a good book, a conversation with a fellow boarder. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I have, and I've chosen to live it with dignity. They sat in silence for a while, the morning sun climbing higher, filling the office with golden light. Victoria felt as if she were seeing the world clearly for the first time, all her assumptions and prejudices stripped away by James's quiet honesty. I'm sorry, she said finally, for last night, for trying to humiliate you, for being so cruel. James turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face. Why did you do it? What did you hope to gain? Victoria struggled to answer, to put into words the twisted logic that had seemed so reasonable just days ago. I wanted to feel powerful, she admitted. I wanted to remind myself that I was above all that I was safe from the kind of fall you experienced. I thought if I could make you look small, it would make me feel bigger. But instead, she trailed off, unable to finish. Instead, you realize that cruelty doesn't make you strong. It just makes you cruel, James finished for her. And that the power you were wielding was hollow, built on nothing but the accident of your birth. Yes, Victoria whispered. Exactly that. So what will you do now? James asked. Now that you've seen behind the curtain, now that you understand that your position is more fragile than you thought. It was a good question, perhaps the most important question Victoria had ever been asked. What would she do with this new understanding? Would she retreat back into her comfortable cruelty? Or would she find the courage to change? I don't know, she said honestly. But I think I want to be better. I want to be someone who builds people up rather than tearing them down. I want to use my privilege for something meaningful instead of just protecting it. James smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. That's a good start, but be warned, it's harder than you think. Changing yourself, changing the patterns you've built over a lifetime, requires constant effort and vigilance. You'll fail sometimes. You'll slip back into old habits. The question is whether you'll have the courage to keep trying. Will you help me? Victoria asked impulsively. Will you teach me how to see the world the way you do? James looked surprised. I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach anyone anything. Lady Thornwood. Victoria, she corrected. Please, call me Victoria. And you're more qualified than anyone I know. You've lived on both sides of society's divide. You understand both privilege and poverty. You've maintained your humanity and dignity through circumstances that would have broken most people. If anyone can teach me how to be a better person, it's you. James considered this, his expression thoughtful. On one condition, he said finally, anything. Don't make me a project or a charity case. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, friendship, mentorship, whatever this becomes, it has to be between equals. Not lady and janitor, not rich and poor, but two people trying to understand each other in the world we live in. Can you do that? Victoria thought about it, really thought about it. Could she set aside her ingrained sense of superiority? Could she see James as an equal, despite the vast difference in their circumstances? It would require her to dismantle everything she'd been taught about social hierarchy and her place in it. I can try, she said. I want to try. Then we have an agreement, James said, extending his hand. Victoria took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. It was the handshake of a working man, honest and firm. And in that moment, something shifted between them. A connection forged not in the glittering ballroom, but in the quiet honesty of a Sunday morning conversation. Over the following weeks, an unlikely friendship developed between Victoria Thornwood and James Whitmore. They met regularly, sometimes at the shipping offices after hours, sometimes at the public library, once even at the boarding house where James lived, much to the shock of his fellow residents. They talked about everything: philosophy, politics, literature, the nature of society and justice and human dignity. James introduced Victoria to a world she'd never truly seen, despite living in the same city. He took her to the neighborhoods where the working poor lived, showed her the conditions they endured, introduced her to people whose struggles she'd never considered. She met seamstresses who worked 16-hour days for wages that barely covered rent, dock workers injured on the job with no compensation, children who should have been in school, but instead worked in factories to help feed their families. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking, and Victoria felt the comfortable walls of her privileged existence crumbling with each new revelation. But James was patient with her, answering her questions, challenging her assumptions without judgment, helping her develop a more nuanced understanding of the world's complexities. In turn, Victoria shared her own struggles with James, the pressure of managing her father's business empire, the loneliness of her position, the constant performance required to maintain her social status. She confessed her fears of failure, her sense that she was living a life scripted by others, rather than one she'd chosen for herself. You have more freedom than you realize, James told her one evening as they sat in the library, surrounded by books. Yes, there are expectations and obligations, but you also have resources and power that most people can only dream of. The question is, how you'll use them. Will you use your position to maintain the status quo, or will you use it to create change? What kind of change? Victoria asked. That's for you to decide, James replied, But I'll tell you what I'd do if I had your resources. I'd improve working conditions at the shipping company. Better wages, safer environments, reasonable hours. I'd invest in education programs for workers' children. I'd use my social influence to advocate for labor reforms. I'd prove that business success and human dignity aren't mutually exclusive. The ideas excited Victoria in a way nothing had in years. She'd been raised to view the business as simply a means of generating profit. But James was suggesting a different model. One where success was measured not just in financial returns, but in human flourishing. She began implementing changes at Thornwood Shipping, starting small but with clear intent. She raised wages for the lowest paid workers, improved safety protocols, reduced working hours. She faced resistance from the company's board, from other business owners who saw her reforms as dangerous precedent, from members of her own social circle who accused her of betraying her class. But she persisted, drawing strength from her conversations with James, from the gratitude of workers whose lives improved because of her decisions, from the growing sense that she was finally living according to her own values, rather than simply following the script society had written for her. The changes in Victoria didn't go unnoticed. Margaret, her cousin, confronted her one afternoon at a society tea. "What's happened to you?" Margaret demanded, her voice pitched low but intense. "Everyone's talking about how you've gone soft, how you're coddling the workers, how you're spending time with that Omega janitor. You're making yourself a laughingstock, Victoria." Victoria set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Am I? Or am I finally becoming someone worth respecting? Tell me, Margaret, what have you done with your life that matters? What will you be remembered for besides wearing expensive dresses and gossiping about people you consider beneath you?" Margaret's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "How dare you?" "I dare, because I've learned something important," Victoria interrupted. "I've learned that the opinion of people who've never struggled, never suffered, never questioned their privilege, doesn't matter as much as I thought it did. I've learned that there's more to life than maintaining social status. And I've learned that the person I was 6 months ago, cruel, shallow, empty, was someone I'm ashamed to have been." She stood, gathering her gloves and purse. "You can join me in trying to be better, or you can continue as you are. But either way, I'm done apologizing for choosing substance over performance." As she left the tea, Victoria felt lighter than she had in years. She was burning bridges with her old life, yes, but those bridges had led nowhere worth going. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers, chosen deliberately rather than simply accepted. Winter gave way to spring, and the friendship between Victoria and James deepened into something neither of them had quite expected. They discovered they enjoyed each other's company, not just for the intellectual stimulation, but for the simple pleasure of being understood. James appreciated Victoria's sharp mind and growing compassion, her willingness to question everything she'd been taught and rebuild her worldview from the ground up. Victoria treasured James's wisdom and steadiness, his ability to find meaning and beauty in the simplest things, his complete lack of pretense. One April evening, as they walked through the Boston Common watching the early flowers bloom, Victoria asked the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. What if you didn't have to be a janitor anymore? What if you could teach again, do the work you were trained for? James smiled sadly. "That's a nice dream, Victoria, but it's not realistic. Nothing has changed about my circumstances. I still have no connections, no references, no way back into that world." "But what if you did?" Victoria pressed. "What if someone with influence and resources decided to help you? Not as charity, but because they recognized your value and wanted to see you in a position where you could make a real difference." James stopped walking, turning to face her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Boston needs teachers who understand both privilege and poverty, who can educate the next generation to be more thoughtful and compassionate than ours has been. I'm suggesting that I could fund a new school, one that serves students from all social classes, and that you could help design and lead it. Not as my employee or my project, but as my partner in creating something meaningful. James stared at her, emotions flickering across his face too quickly to name. Victoria, I can't accept that kind of help. It's too much. It would make me dependent on you. Would change the nature of our friendship. Would it? Victoria interrupted. Or would it be two people using their different resources and abilities to create something neither could create alone? You have the knowledge, the experience, the vision. I have the money and the social connections. Together we could build something that actually matters, that actually changes lives. How is that dependence? How is that anything but partnership? James was quiet for a long time, his gray eyes searching hers. Why? He asked finally. Why would you do this for me? Victoria took a breath, knowing that her answer would reveal more than she'd intended, but finding she didn't care. Because you changed my life. Because you showed me what it means to live with integrity and dignity. Because I've come to care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. And because I believe that if we work together, we can create something beautiful and important and lasting. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. James's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hand, a gesture that would have been scandalous if anyone had seen. An Omega touching a lady of Victoria's status so familiarly. You've changed my life too, he said quietly. I'd given up on the idea that I could be anything more than what I am now. I'd made peace with it, but it was the peace of resignation, not fulfillment. You've reminded me that there are still possibilities, still reasons to hope. And I've come to care about you as well, more than is probably wise given the difference in our circumstances. What if circumstances didn't matter? Victoria asked, her heart pounding. What if we decided that the connection between us was more important than social conventions or class differences? What if we chose each other, deliberately and completely, regardless of what anyone else thought? James's hand tightened on hers. Are you sure? You'd be giving up so much. Your social position, your reputation, the respect of your peers. An Omega and a lady, it's not done, Victoria. You'd be ostracized. By people whose respect I no longer want, Victoria replied firmly. The people who matter, the people whose opinions I actually value will understand, and those who don't. Well, I've learned that I can live without their approval. James pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face gently. You're remarkable, he said. You're brave and stubborn, and you've grown so much in these past months. I never imagined when I walked into your gala that night that it would lead here, to this moment. Neither did I, Victoria admitted. I thought I was setting up a cruel joke. Instead, I met someone who would fundamentally change who I am and what I want from life. Funny how things work out. James smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. So what do we do now? Now, Victoria said, we build something together. The school first because that's important and it will help people. But also a life, a partnership, a future that we choose for ourselves rather than accepting what society dictates. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is, James finished. But yes. Yes to all of it. To the school, to the partnership, to choosing each other despite everything that says we shouldn't. Yes. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Victoria didn't want to. She met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. It was a kiss that sealed a partnership, that marked the beginning of something new and uncertain and potentially wonderful. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. So, James said, a hint of humor in his voice, I suppose this means I should probably stop calling you Lady Thornwood. Victoria laughed, the sound bright and free. I think that would be appropriate. Yes. Just Victoria. Always just Victoria to you. Victoria, James repeated, as if testing how it felt. I like it. It suits you better than the title ever did. They walked on through the common, hand in hand, making plans for the school, for their future, for the life they would build together. Around them, Boston continued its evening routines, people hurrying home to dinner, vendors closing their carts, gas lamps flickering to life as twilight deepened. Neither Victoria nor James noticed the stares they received, the Omega janitor and the shipping heiress walking together as equals, as partners, as something more. They were too busy imagining the possibilities, too focused on each other, and the future they were creating to care about the judgment of strangers. The school they founded opened the following autumn, housed in a building Victoria purchased in a neighborhood that bridged the divide between Boston's wealthy and working-class districts. It was called the Thornwood Whitmore Academy, the joined names a deliberate statement about partnership and equality. The curriculum James designed was revolutionary, combining classical education with practical skills, serving students from all social classes, taught by teachers who were selected for their passion and ability rather than their social connections. The opening was controversial. Many of Victoria's former friends refused to attend, scandalized by her relationship with James and her radical ideas about education. But others came, progressive thinkers, reformers, working-class families desperate for opportunities for their children, and even a few members of the old guard who'd been quietly uncomfortable with the status quo and were glad to see someone challenging it. Victoria stood at the entrance on opening day, greeting students and families, with James beside her. He'd transformed over the past months, not in his essential character, which remained as steady and genuine as ever, but in his circumstances. He wore a proper suit now, purchased with his salary as the school's headmaster, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone doing work that mattered, work he was born to do. But the most significant change was in his eyes. The sadness that had shadowed them was gone, replaced by hope and purpose and joy. He'd found his way back to the life he was meant to live, not by denying what he'd been through, but by integrating those experiences into something new and meaningful. As the students filed in, children from mansions and tenements, from families of privilege and families of struggle, all of them eager to learn, Victoria felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what wealth and privilege should be used for: creating opportunities, building bridges, making the world more just and equitable. Nervous? James asked quietly, watching the stream of students. Terrified, Victoria admitted. What if it doesn't work? What if we've made a terrible mistake? James took her hand, squeezing gently. Then we'll learn from it and try again. That's what we do, Victoria. We try, we fail, we learn, we improve. It's not about being perfect. It's about being committed to something larger than ourselves. Victoria looked at him, this man who'd entered her life as a joke and become her partner, her love, her guide to becoming a better person. How did you get so wise? Suffering, James said simply. Failure, loss. All the things I wouldn't wish on anyone, but that taught me what truly matters. You've had your own journey, your own lessons. Together, we've both become more than we were separately. The bell rang, signaling the start of the first day of classes. Students hurried to their rooms, teachers took their positions, and the Thornwood Whitmore Academy began its work of educating minds and challenging the social structures that kept people trapped in their assigned places. Victoria and James stood together, watching it all unfold, knowing that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, financial pressures, social opposition, the constant struggle to maintain their vision against forces that wanted to preserve the status quo. But they would face those challenges together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to build something meaningful with their unlikely connection. As the months and years passed, the academy flourished. Students who would never have had access to quality education found their talents nurtured and their horizons expanded. Some went on to universities, others to skilled trades, all of them carrying with them the Academy's core message: that human worth isn't determined by birth or wealth, that education is a right, not a privilege, and that society's rigid hierarchies can and should be challenged. Victoria's business reforms at Thornwood Shipping became a model for other companies, proving that treating workers with dignity and paying fair wages didn't destroy profits. It actually improved productivity and loyalty. Other business owners began to follow her example, slowly, reluctantly, but steadily. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they were real, and they improved lives. James thrived in his role as headmaster, beloved by students and respected by parents from all social classes. He never forgot where he'd come from, never lost his empathy for those struggling at the bottom of society's ladder. But he also never let his past define his future. He'd taken the lessons of his fall and rebuilding and transformed them into wisdom that he shared generously with everyone around him. Their relationship continued to scandalize some segments of Boston society, but Victoria and James didn't care. They'd built a life based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. A life that was richer and more meaningful than anything either of them could have achieved alone. They married quietly, in a small ceremony, attended by friends who valued substance over status, and they built a home that was warm and welcoming, filled with books and laughter, and the constant flow of students and teachers and reformers who gathered there to discuss ideas and plan changes. On the 5th anniversary of the Academy's founding, Victoria and James stood together in the school's courtyard, watching the graduation ceremony. Students from their first class were receiving diplomas, preparing to go out into the world and make their marks. Some were heading to universities, others to apprenticeships, all of them equipped with education and confidence and the belief that they could shape their own destinies. "Do you remember that night?" Victoria asked quietly, watching the celebration. "The night of the gala when I invited you as a joke." James smiled. "How could I forget? It was the night my life changed. The night I met someone who would challenge me to hope again, to believe that second chances were possible." "I was so cruel," Victoria said, shaking her head at the memory. "So shallow and empty. I can't believe I thought humiliating you would make me feel powerful." "But you learned," James reminded her. "You changed. That's what matters. Not who you were, but who you chose to become." Victoria leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady strength that had become her anchor. "I invited you to mock you, and instead you saved me. You showed me what it means to live with integrity, to find meaning in work and relationships rather than status and wealth. You gave me a purpose beyond just maintaining my privilege." "We saved each other," James corrected gently. "I was resigned to a life of quiet survival, going through the motions, but never really living. You reminded me that I had more to offer, that my experiences and knowledge could be used to help others. You gave me back my sense of purpose." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their students celebrate, watching the fruit of their partnership and their love. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the courtyard was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation and hope. "What do you think happens next?" Victoria asked. "Where do we go from here?" James considered the question, his gray eyes thoughtful. "We keep building. We expand the academy, open more schools in other cities. We continue advocating for reforms, for justice, for a world where everyone has the opportunity to develop their potential, regardless of their circumstances. We live our lives as an example of what's possible when people choose connection over division, compassion over cruelty, partnership over hierarchy." "That sounds like a good plan," Victoria said, smiling. "A very good plan indeed." As the evening deepened and the graduation celebration continued around them, Victoria Thornwood and James Whitmore stood together, two people from different worlds who'd found each other through an act of intended cruelty that had somehow transformed into grace. They'd both been changed by their unlikely meeting. Victoria from a shallow, cruel woman into someone who used her privilege to create opportunity and justice. James from a resigned survivor into a passionate educator and advocate for change. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic, no sudden transformation, no easy resolution. It was something better. A story of two flawed people who chose to grow, to challenge themselves and their society, to build something meaningful together. It was a story of redemption and second chances, of the power of genuine connection to transform lives, of the possibility that exists when people are willing to see beyond social constructs to the human beings beneath. The poor Omega who'd been invited to a gala as a joke had walked into that ballroom with dignity and walked out having planted the seeds of revolution. Not a violent revolution, but a quiet one, built on education and compassion and the radical idea that every person, regardless of their station, deserves respect and opportunity. And the wealthy lady who'd meant to mock him had instead found herself challenged, changed, and ultimately saved by the very person she'd sought to humiliate. Years later, when people asked Victoria about the turning point in her life, she always pointed to that winter night when James Whitmore walked into her gala. "I invited him to prove my superiority," she would say. Instead, he proved that dignity, intelligence, and worth have nothing to do with wealth or status. He taught me what it means to be truly human. And in doing so, he gave me a life worth living. And James, when asked about his journey from poverty back to purpose, would smile and say, "I learned that falling isn't the end of your story. It's just a chapter. What matters is what you do next, how you rebuild, what you choose to create from the ruins." I was invited to a gala as a joke, but I walked in as myself, completely, authentically, without apology. And that choice changed everything. Their story became legend in Boston, told and retold, inspiring others to question the rigid social hierarchies that governed their lives, to see beyond class and status to the human potential that exists in everyone. The Thornwood Whitmore Academy grew into a network of schools that spread across New England and beyond, each one carrying forward the vision of education as a tool for social justice and human flourishing. And at the center of it all were two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd chosen each other despite every social convention that said they shouldn't, and who'd built a life and a legacy that proved that love, partnership, and shared purpose could overcome any obstacle. The Wolf Lady had invited the poor Omega as a joke, but the joke was on her, because in trying to humiliate him, she'd set in motion a chain of events that would transform them both, challenge their society, and create ripples of change that would continue long after they were gone. And that, perhaps, was the greatest irony of all, that an act of cruelty, met with dignity and grace, could become the foundation for something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting. That a joke could become a love story, and a love story could become a revolution. As the stars came out over Boston that graduation night, Victoria and James walked home together, hand in hand, talking about their plans for the future, laughing at shared jokes, comfortable in the life they'd built together. They were no longer the people they'd been that winter night 5 years ago. They were better, stronger, more complete. And somewhere in the city, a young person who'd been told they were too poor, too lowborn, too insignificant to matter, heard the story of the Wolf Lady and the poor Omega, and dared to hope that they, too, might transcend their circumstances, that they, too, might find their dignity and purpose and place in the world. That was the true legacy of that winter night when James Whitmore walked into Victoria Thornwood's gala. Not just the love story or the schools or the social reforms, but the hope that spread like ripples in a pond, touching lives that Victoria and James would never know, inspiring changes they would never see, creating a future that was more just and compassionate because two people had chosen to see beyond social constructs to the human beings beneath. The poor Omega had been invited as a joke, but he'd arrived as himself, and in doing so, he'd changed the world.